everyone. My name is Caitlin Yeager, Director of Heritage Programs for Missouri Humanities. Our mission is to enrich lives and strengthen communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Thank you so much for joining us today for our three-part community engagement workshop, part of our Cultural Heritage Workshop program, dedicated to providing tools and resources necessary for communities to reevaluate cultural heritage assets, improve community involvement, and increase tourism and economic development opportunities. This is our second webinar of the day, and we are joined by Chris Kemke of Extension, where he'll present on interregional cooperation and creating critical mass. This morning, we heard a presentation from Mandy Redder of Missouri Humanities about marketing and social media engagement. And we'll finish up this afternoon with our 3 p.m. webinar, Creating and Sustaining an Effective Volunteer Program, with our friends from the State Archives. If you missed our morning session, it is available to view on our Facebook page under the video tab, and will also be made available on our website and YouTube channel next week. Whether you are joining us on Zoom or watching on Facebook Live, we invite you to be part of the conversation. If you're on Facebook, feel free to comment to let us know you're watching or to ask questions for us to consider. And if you're on Zoom, feel free to submit questions using either the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we'll try and answer as many as possible towards the end of our program today. If you enjoyed the program and are interested in seeing more from Missouri Humanities, please check us out on Facebook or on our website for the most up-to-date information about our events. We also have a really great membership program where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to members-only events. To become a member, visit mohumanities.org and click on the Become a Member button on the right-hand corner. At the conclusion of each webinar, a survey will pop up on the screen. I would really appreciate it, and I'm sure Chris would too, if you could all take the time to let us know what you thought of the presentation today. These surveys are very important as we continue to bring public programming to Missourians and work toward a more thoughtful, informed, and civil society. So with all that, I'd like to turn this over to Chris Kemke, Community Economic Development Specialist for University of Missouri Extension, and he'll get us started on our presentation. So Chris, go ahead.
Thank you, Caitlin, for that stellar introduction. I couldn't have asked for better. Thank you guys for joining my session today. Caitlin gave it a much more elegant and I think defined title, but I like to think about it as we all get by with a little help from our friends, just like the old Beatles title, a case for the regional approach in community tourism and community cultural heritage endeavors. What do I mean by the regional approach? You could define it in many ways, but I think the key aspects of what the regional approach to community tourism is understanding that communities share resources between each other, that we're not as isolated as we like to think we are, that many of the infrastructure for travel, for workforce development, these sort of things are already shared between our communities as we speak. They're already in those states. Communities cooperating with their neighbors are able to pool together and leverage their resources more efficiently. So we already, because we already share so many of these things together, when we actually are working together, planning and focusing our efforts to make sure that we're covering the needs, the areas of need that we have with these amenities and these needs, and we're at the same time strengthening, working on our strengths, we can leverage those more effectively. And the key is to see each other as partners, not competitors. And there's a lot of good data and a lot of things that have changed in the world to really cause us to rethink the way we've traditionally thought about our regional neighbors. One thing you're going to notice about my use of the regional approach is I'm not defining exactly what that region looks like. And I'm sure that's a question that would probably come about, is what exactly is my region, Chris? And I would say that can vastly depend based on the type of attractions you're working in, the kind of community you are, whether you're rural, suburban, or urban, the scale of kind of work that you're doing, whether you're advertising along a highway coalition or thinking more around a single primary attraction, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But region can be a little bit hard to define, but generally, when I go through and discuss some of the workforce development elements, I'm going to give you kind of a better idea of what that might look like in your particular area, neck of the woods. One of the key things that makes regionalism so important, especially when it comes to travel and tourism, is as the world shrinks, the regional approach is more important than ever. What I mean by that is this: the distances between us have shrunk. Now, of course, they haven't shrunk in their actual physical distance by any means, but they have shrunk in the amount of time it takes for us to get to our locations. What you're looking at is a map from 1914, published by a British travel company, about the distance of travel it takes to get from London. And what you'll notice if you look down at the scale at the bottom, that region in red is within 5 days. So that was the shortest sort of radius from London was a 5-day journey out to the south of France, there to the Balkans, into Scandinavia, extending all the way to over 40 days to get to some parts of Africa, of Canada, of Australia, and those sort of things. If we look at this map, that on this next map that on its surface appears to be almost identical, it looked very similar. It's actually sort of a cleverly changed map to show what this looks like in 2016. And you can tell just by looking at our scale that now our red area is within a half day and our longest journeys are within a day and a half of travel. So what this really just demonstrates is that in the past, where our travel was so much more localized and we were competing for tourists going short distances by today's standards to attractions, the world has changed so much more. So we had to think so much bigger than just our individual communities, especially rural communities like we have in Missouri, and not see ourselves as isolated, but rather working together to get that critical mass to get people to see us. And that the distance between our communities in the region is not as significant by far as it was even just several decades ago, and how quickly that has changed. Another important factor is we already share what I call the infrastructure of tourism, the infrastructure of travel. And there are a couple main components to that. The first one is the workforce component, which is key to any tourism or cultural heritage attraction. They all need folks to be able to work them, folks that have skills in these particular areas. Otherwise, we can't, support our attractions. We can't support our endeavors. So workforce is one of the key components of that. And the other things will be other supportive industries that we'll talk about in a minute. I think one helpful image that can kind of help you visualize what the workforce situation looks like across the state of Missouri is our Office of Budget Management County Classification, which sort of categorizes counties based on their workforce relationship with one another. I think this is a really great way to visualize where your individual county fits and to have an understanding of how workforce is shared in around these different metro and micropolitan areas. So in the red, you have what we call micropolitan central counties. These are counties with at least a population of 50,000 individuals. In the pink area around it, places like in the St. Louis area, Lincoln, Warren, Franklin, and in the Kansas City area, Clinton, Ray, Lafayette, we have what we call metropolitan outlying counties. These are counties that send at least 25% of their workforce into the metropolitan central county. So a significant part of their workforce dependent on the economy in those major metros. Micropolitan central counties are the ones in that kind of yellowish, goldish, dark gold. Those are counties that fit in between the 10,000 and 50,000 mark that retain most of their workers in the county. Micropolitan outlying counties send 25% of their workforce into those micropolitan central communities. And the rural, everything in white is rural counties. These kind of are counties that don't fit any of those standards. They're below 10,000 individuals, and they do not send 25% of their workforce into another county classification. So what this demonstrates and helps you visualize is just how interconnected our workforce is across the state, how closely tied it is. We can look at that a little bit more specifically. I'm here in Marion County in the Hannibal area, and a very valuable tool that for you practitioners out there, I would suggest you use and look at, called the Census Bureau's On the Map. Allows you to kind of measure and have an understanding of workforce flows within a county or a region or even an individual city. As you can see, if I take a look at Marion County, what you're being able to see here is the number of folks who are coming into our county for work, the amount of residents who are working within our county, and the amount of residents that are commuting out of our county to work. So you can see there's a pretty robust flow of all three of these categories. Very equal numbers of individuals who are driving into work jobs, those who are working jobs within the community, and those that are kind of going out to our surrounding areas. That's also demonstrated in this map, which is kind of confusing. There's two maps that I think both share very valuable information. This being a map of where individuals working in a particular county live at. So in this case, we're looking at Marion County, and we're looking at where Marion County's workers live at. And as you can see, the large chunks of our workforce here in Marion County, a county that has a fairly significant tourism industry, are shared across many of our surrounding counties, including Adams, which is home to Quincy, Illinois, a fairly large micropolitan center, and Rawls, which is a much more rural county. That is still, we are very dependent on a workforce traveling from these places to come to us. Vice versa, if we take a look at our residents here in Marion County and look at where they're going traveling to work, we have a even broader picture, and this is not uncommon to see in this particular metric. And not only do we send workers to Adams County and Rawls County, these ones around us, but even down into the St. Louis and Columbia metros. The point of all this is to say that the workforce happenings in different areas, different counties around us, different communities around us, very much have an impact on our own, in that they're intershared, so that we can't think of these as separate workforces, that initiatives that happen in communities near us or counties over from us are not related to our own, but they are intimately tied to our own workforce pool and our own success then in our attractions in our tourism industry. Another thing that we tend to share is just our travel infrastructure. Oftentimes, communities share important travel infrastructure with each other to support travelers coming into the area, including things like hotels, airports, train stations, rental car locations, restaurants, all these sort of things. Just because an individual is using those in a larger community adjacent to ours or within our region doesn't mean we're not going to benefit from those things. And if we want people to be able to visit our own communities, if we're in smaller communities, that are sort of satellites to micropolitan and metro areas, we depend on those amenities being there so that folks can get to us. And I think a key point to remember from this section is to consider that last point of mine, which is success in your region's travel infrastructure is key to your community success. If it declines regionally, it will impact your whole community. And I think it's important to think about that even in terms of workforce or in these other, or to take an interest in these other travel infrastructure items that have direct impact on your communities, even if they're not directly located within them. A good example with this is there's a firm here that I've worked with before, the extensions work with, GSG, their hospitality group. What this map kind of indicates is it shows the number of rooms, hotel rooms available in a particular area. So this is actually the Sioux City area up in Iowa. And you can see that the thing to consider is if we had a heritage museum here in Winnebago across the border in South Dakota, or we did a festival in that community, that the community itself, of course, would not have the travel infrastructure, if you will, to support people even staying the night if it was a overnight sort of event. So we're depending on that room availability up in Sioux City and up in Wayne to be able to support that event. We need that travel infrastructure here to be able to support what's going on in Winnebago. Winnebago likely I'm not familiar directly with that community, but it's very likely that it would not be profitable to have a hotel there all the time, and definitely not enough that would have enough accommodations for a large event. But they kind of rely on these outside the other communities in the region who do have this infrastructure. So for the folks in that community, the well-being of the infrastructure there, the quality of hotels, the quality of travel accommodations, trains, airports, these things is extremely important for themselves, which just shows how important it is to be engaged with each other. on these issues. It's not a thing that this is not an issue too that Sioux City is now without some interest in, because even if folks are really just headed through them to go to these other outside communities to attend, to visit family, or to visit other types of attraction, the kind of things that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, they're going to utilize Sioux City's amenities, put money into that community. So there's a mutual benefit to be had with this infrastructure set up, and having all parties engaged and working together to make sure that this is as solid and as developed as we can get it is really important for all. So we kind of talked a little bit about the mechanics of travel and tourism that we share, the workforce element that we do, the fact that we share so many workers between our communities, that when we invest in workforce development in our neighboring counties, that we also benefit from that, because we are in fact sharing many of their workers, and many of our own workers are working in their communities, and that there are many just travel infrastructure elements that we're sharing between ourselves, things like hotels, those bus stations, all those kind of things. There's also the element of regionalism, of looking at the package of attractions you're putting together. So how to use the regional approach to maximize the resources that you have in tourism. That's what we're going to kind of focus on in the second part of this presentation. To kind of talk about that, we had to talk about the types of attractions, because different types of attractions, of course, draw wildly different tourists. That people are interested in vastly different things. For instance, I think that for a lot of folks who don't work in the industry, it might be surprising to know that going to see friends and family is still the number one reason most people travel, which can vary quite differently from things that are more in the cultural, historic vein, or kind of more large scale attractions like a major theme park or something of the like. But different types attract different kinds of people. Today's marketing requires multiple appeals to visitors. People, when they travel, they want to maximize their trip by having enough, a critical mass, if you will, of attractions to be able to see. And usually either they want those to vary and have a lot of variety, and that's often important, or to have a lot of depth in one of these areas. The key is that for smaller communities, like most of ours across Missouri, is that we often don't have an adequate number of these different types of attractions just in any single one of our communities. Even in places like Hannibal, which definitely have a more developed tourism industry than many of the communities its size, still does not on its own have answers in all these different attraction type areas. So that's when working with your surrounding communities in your region to enhance your offerings is extremely important. And the more that we can expand our offering types, the more of these sections that we can have an answer for, that we can offer, art-based attractions, events, certain, architecture, infrastructure type attractions, certain businesses that draw a pull, whether it's something like Wall Drug or something a little bit more lower scale, like quilting shops. The more that we can keep, the longer we can keep people in our community, in our region, the longer they're there, the more we push out overnight stays and just meals, the more revenue that we're generating off of that. So working as a region to make sure that we're filling in as many of these kind of areas as possible, these types of attractions, expands our offerings, allows us to retain visitors longer and generate more revenue off of them collectively. A way to think about, so we talked about the different types of attractions, but within those types, there's two very important distinctions that I think are important when you consider building your attraction package in your region, thinking regionally about your attractions. The first is those primary attractions. Primary attractions are influence a traveler's decision on where to go. They're usually the main reason for visiting. They have a strong sway over the area's image often. So as I mentioned before a couple of times, I live in Hannibal. So the Mark Twain Museum is both of these things. It's a large enough attraction that it's the primary reason people often come up to see us here. and it also has a more than a strong sway, you could say, over the area's image and sort of setting the theme for the scenery of the community. This the whole the theme of the community and how people perceive it. Secondary attractions are also very important. They enhance the experience. Sometimes they're the most memorable part of the trip that someone takes is to the ice cream shop that they encountered while they were visiting, like, you know, something like the museum, or could be even like a mini golf thing. These attractions people wouldn't go drive any distance to go do, but, you know, thoroughly enjoy once they're here. They're not the primary reason that people come to the area. They don't have a strong drawing power, but they definitely round out the experience. They're essential to make to hold folks into a community and to spend a complete trip in an area. So oftentimes, especially when we think about small communities across the state, what we have are a lot of secondary type attractions to folks who are not from our region, either whether it's folks who are visiting family in our region, or whether they're coming to see something kind of nearby. Our attractions may not rise to the level of secondary attractions for them, whether it's kind of our, our regional community museums, or sometimes our infrastructure like state parks or conservation areas. These aren't things that aren't going to necessarily draw people in on their own, but they are essential to kind of rounding out experience. So the goal for many Missouri small communities is how do we kind of come together to fit these together, that we can kind of enhance an experience around a primary attraction. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like here in attraction packaging. Do I have some questions in the chat before I go further? I want to make sure I didn't leave anyone behind.
I think you're okay for now.
Okay, good.
We do have someone that, if at some point, you can do this at the end, actually, if you want, the link to that infographic of the census data, the micropolitan, metropolitan, and rural distinction. If I know that it was on your slide, but if you want to, if you're able to like copy paste that into the chat, or even send it to me and I can send it to them later.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Absolutely. Because I think just to kind of revisit that point, that yes, your workforce, which is the key to being able to keep attractions, running, to make sure that they have adequate staff, that we share those across counties. And I think it's important for you to know what that looks like in your region, and think about what things you can do, the programs you can bring in. Like we have at MU a tourism customer service training program, bringing those kind of initiatives into your community and making sure that the reach is broad enough to hit your entire workforce, whether they're in your particular town or in the counties and communities around you. But kind of back on track with attraction packaging. This is where we stick together both those elements, the types of attractions that we have and the primary and secondary element, to make a offering that is sufficient to be able to draw people in, to keep them in our communities, preferably overnight if we can, and to make it worth the drive to get that bigger draw from further away. Few attractions today can stand alone in today's marketplace. It's just with travel, as easy as it is, it's if you only have a single attraction in the region, it's easy for people to either just sort of ignore it, or to do it on the way to something out of our region, maybe just as their only stop. It's just hard for it to stand on its own. Travelers want to combine several activities together. The drawing power of attractions tends to be stronger. There's a set of complementary features or activities. Kind of like we'll talk about in a minute, those can either be things that fall in the same vein and the same type of attraction, or are built off of a single theme, or are very diverse so that it can kind of hit multiple different needs and interests of a group of travelers. Attraction and packaging involves selecting a core group of attractions that represent a strong, concise message, or those that complement one another. Kind of like I was saying, either we want to build upon a certain theme, or we want to be able to have diverse attractions that build off of each other, that meet multiple different needs and interests of a traveler. Attraction packages can either be built around one or two primary attractions with a strong drawing power. So if we have an attraction that, like, Branson has, several major ones, or even I would say here in Hannibal with the Mark Twain Museum, that have quite a bit of draw power on their own. We can build around a couple primary attractions like that, and have lots of secondary attractions like complementing those. Or we can build around several primary attractions with weaker draw, but who together reach a critical mass. The case study that I'm going to conclude my conversation with about the villages of Van Buren in Van Buren County, Iowa, is a great example of that. They have sort of a what I would call maybe a weaker set of primary attractions that have a weaker draw power on their own. Not that they're weak attractions, but that their drawing power is probably weaker on its own, but put together and coordinated along with events, actually reaches that critical mass level to get folks to travel to their community to participate in their events and see their attractions. For smaller communities, the regional approach to attraction packaging is always necessary, even if a community possesses a strong primary attraction. So in most of the communities around Missouri, for any of those communities that I had on the board that aren't, those metropolitan center counties or metropolitan outlying counties, chances are that even if you have a very good primary attraction, whether it's something like a state park or a significant museum or a notable business or any of those things that we saw on the types of attraction list, it's unlikely that your community on its own possesses enough secondary elements to hold individuals in that region for the amount of time that you'd like. So it becomes paramount, more than even larger areas, to be working and understanding what are those other attractions in your area and the outer communities that can be brought in and advertised together to present a suite of options to someone coming into your community. The key is to help not make the traveler think about this and have to come up with it on their own. You're trying to present it together so that it has the feel and look of a longer of a trip worth taking for a longer distance, a longer amount of time. It also can kind of help create a certain idea or aesthetic of your community if you're trying to, if that's important to your tourism identity. Obviously, here in Hannibal, there's the time period of which Mark Twain wrote is a major theme of the area, and so attractions tend to complement off of that. Villages of Van Buren are the same, the ones that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So because it is important that packaging attractions is of the utmost importance to a rural region's success, it's important to make sure that we're getting a good assessment of our region's resources. This is important because we get caught up. It's easy for us all to get caught up in the activities and the work of our own particular community and its needs, and to kind of have a general understanding of what's in the region around us, what the workforce looks like a little bit, what are the kind of amenities other communities have, what are the attractions they have. We kind of know these things, but it's easy to not be very versed on it, or to have an even true understanding, maybe one that's based off of a past situation that we kind of carry forward, or a misconception. But in order to be able to stick these things together and to be working together to make sure that you're providing that travel infrastructure, and that providing a workforce for your attractions, and to be packaging your attractions to make adequate, to create adequate stays and to adequate traveling packages, you really need to be active about understanding these things and addressing the needs. So build relationships with other leaders and attraction owners in your region. That's, I think, key number one, is to make sure you're reaching out, not seeing them as competition, but understanding that cooperation between your different communities and attractions is going to be paramount for success. Take assessment of your region's workforce, travel infrastructure, and primary and secondary attractions. At MU Extension, we actually have a number of resources that we can provide communities with to help them evaluate their region's attractions, to see what types are represented within their region that are there, to evaluate different attractions, to consider if they're primary or secondary, and then to have an idea of what that draw power is, where are we pulling people from, how far are they coming to get here. Also, there's plenty of assessments that we also can offer communities to assess their region's workforce, to have an understanding of what their skill level of the workforce is, what the hospitality skill level is in their region, and taking just a simple accounting of the travel infrastructure, knowing what's in your region to help move travelers to and through your communities, what the condition and state of all those are, what's the sustainability of them long term, as the travel industry can be fickle. Taking an assessment and understanding where your community is at is extremely important for being able to do the planning going forward. So then after you have an understanding of that, you've done that assessment, taking a cooperative approach to advancing your region's workforce and take a cooperative approach in addressing your region's workforce and infrastructure. Ensure these moves are benefiting the entire region and not just one community. So really, especially in the workforce development area, you just have to absolutely think regionally these days. Those graphics I showed at the beginning can kind of demonstrate to you all how interconnected our workforces truly are. So rather than trying to launch workforce initiatives, whether it's training programs around tourism, hospitality, whether it's making sure there's some vocational education that might be relevant to attractions being offered in the area, rather than thinking about those just within your own community or trying to offer them only to your community, buying them for your chamber, for your community, maybe sponsoring a program around tourism, hospitality training. Think about that regionally. Think about getting all the communities around you involved in those efforts, working together on really ideally a sustained effort to make sure that your region has the adequate workforce, because you are sharing those things. Make sure that you're working together to do things to improve the travel infrastructure of your different communities, supporting whether it's sort of legislatively, some of those moves, like things like highway infrastructure and other elements like that. Train stations can be something that can be influenced through legislation, and making sure that your communities are speaking kind of as one voice, that you're advocating together rather than just letting your neighboring larger community do it on its own, or the neighboring community that's trying to advocate for that highway expansion. Make sure that you're working with them to encourage that, because you will see benefits from it as well. And thinking about all these, anytime you're just addressing these things, think about them as affecting the region, not just the area. And there's lots of tools like the ones I've showed, analysis on hotel rooms, of radiuses, driving radiuses that can kind of show you how far you are from certain points of interest. Can all give you an idea of how close you really are and interconnected into these different infrastructure pieces. And then packaging your region's attractions. I can't emphasize that enough. That making sure that once you have an idea of what exists, what the attractions are like, what are your secondary, primary attractions, we also, in extension, have some tools that you can use to kind of understand, the quality of those, the authenticity, how will they fit the theme sort of the area, the general thought of it. Its draw power, ways to measure, how strong that draw power is for that attraction. But making sure that you're clustering those together and you're selling the region's attractions, because that's going to give you something much closer to that critical mass that urban areas can often provide on their own. I think, and there are two ways to kind of look at that, as I said before, whether it's building around some smaller draw primary attractions, or building around a couple stronger primary attractions, and thinking that either, usually both, to build both a theme, if you can, around your attractions, but then also making sure you have the diversity to hit multiple different needs. Because as we all know, if you think about your own family traveling, you know that not everyone in the family is on agreement of what they would like to do with their time. So, travelers make compromises with each other to make sure everyone's needs and interests are met. So the more of those opportunities you have available, the longer you're able to keep travelers to your community. And that kind of leads us here to this case study, a place I'm actually fairly acquainted with. My first assignment extension was in the Missouri County, just south of this county, Van Buren County. So what's Van Buren County? What's their situation? Well, Van Buren County is under 8,000 people for the entire county. Has 12 communities. None of them are over 1,100 individuals. The area is rich in natural beauty and history. It's in the Des Moines River Valley. It was a big trading vein early on in the settlement of Iowa. Some of the oldest parts, really, of the state of Iowa, as steamboats were able to go up the Mississippi and down the Des Moines River, which runs right through the county, and on which most of the communities are situated on. It's a very scenic area, very rural, quite isolated. They're probably 45 minutes from a traffic light if you're in the center of the county to get up to Fairfield, the next largest community outside of the county. A beautiful area with a lot of history, but on its own, they don't necessarily have an attraction that's big enough to have, I would say, enough draw to get people there completely on its own. The closest one is sort of their Dutchman store and a unique Mennonite-owned retail location that does get some bus tours and those things. That's probably their biggest one, frankly. But they have lots of just interesting regional history, state history items, a lot of natural beauty. In that area that isn't as famous as maybe some other, larger or well-known areas in the country, but they do have these tools, and they have leveraged them through an organization they have created called the Villages of Van Buren, which packages attractions and coordinates events. I think this is one of the most clever sort of community tourism strategies I've seen. Not only do they make sure that they sort of package the attractions in their entire county together, advertising attractions in every community in the county, making sure they're all represented in some way, and that what the community considers an attraction or has is represented. But they also coordinate with each other when it comes to festivals and things going on in the county. So, for instance, no community in the county rarely holds a festival on its own. When they do festivals on a weekend, every community has a piece of that festival. So even a community like Pittsburgh, which is just a couple individuals, frankly, or Birmingham, another community in that county with just a couple hundred individuals, they might host a quilting demonstration or a blacksmith demonstration for this festival. And then the next town over might have the concert for that night. And the next town over might have another component, so that it spreads out visits across the county. So it gets people to kind of go throughout the county. They also don't let people just guess on how to get there. They promote all year round, but especially on their festival events, sort of dedicated travel paths, so they do things in the fall, scenic views that they sort of encourage travelers to take certain routes to all the different communities in their county, to kind of get the most, make the most of the natural aesthetic and interlink their communities and encourage that flow of individuals through them all. And in no way could any one of these communities hosting an event, a festival, or one individual of their attractions be enough to get people to come from a distance to do it. But they have successfully, by linking together, by advertising as a united front, their attractions, linking them together with a theme around Iowa's early history and the natural aesthetic of the area, the kind of back to basics, rural lifestyle sort of aesthetic, and theming their things around that. And by making the most of festivals and events that are spread out and interconnected to make it worth the trip for individuals from Des Moines and the St. Louis area and the Quad Cities and Burlington. They have created a pretty successful tourism industry that sees tens of thousands of tourists. I just call their office, a season. One of the great success stories, I think, for a community that otherwise would just seem like that major tourism would be not an option for a community necessarily their size. So at this point, I'll take questions if you all have any about anything I talked about. I know it's information dense presentation, to be sure, but I'd love to talk a little bit more about strategies to kind of maximize your regional workforce, ways that you can work together to promote that travel infrastructure, and a little bit about that packaging and building that critical mass of attractions.
Yeah.
If anyone has any.
So we do have a question asking if there's some way to determine what types of attractions are primary and secondary. Some way to rank what category they would fit.
Yeah, we actually have some tools that I'll make sure that Caitlin can get some of them that you guys can reference, that are some sheets that help you think about these things. This is, I think, one of the hardest things for communities to kind of get an understanding for and a feel for, because the things that matter to us in the community don't always, our outsiders don't always see them the same way. Both ways, both things that we see as important, some oftentimes related to our history or we have a shared experience with in our region, but others it's just not as strong. And the other way around, where sometimes we drive past things and don't give it a second thought. A lot of times they'll have scenery aspects, that sort of thing, that is white noise to us, but to outsiders is extremely valuable. So I think that the best way to think about that is to look at draw and to try to collect an understanding of draw. You can do that through some of the surveys. I'm sure, Caitlin, you probably offered some of that kind of help and assistance. You guys have done programs about trying to get a measure and understanding of who's visiting your attractions. Even those guest books can kind of give you an understanding of who's traveling to come to your area. It's really about that draw factor, about when it comes to a primary type of attraction. The funny thing is as I mentioned before, one of the main primary attractions in every community in the country is seeing friends and family in that area, because that's the thing that people are always going to go back for no matter what. So don't write even things like that off about who's your audience. Make sure that your max when folks come to visit your community because they know people there, that's a major primary attraction, and to make sure that you're reaching out to those people and drawing them into those secondary things. So you can measure the draw of an attraction to kind of understand if it's a primary or not, to understand where are people coming from to see it. I think you can also do a little bit of analysis on an attraction that you think maybe has the potential to be a primary attraction. There's a couple ways to do that. If it's kind of a for-profit business type thing, I think departments like our Small Business Development Center can give you some ideas of what the draw on something like that would be, for sure. Otherwise, it might take, if a new park is established or something like that, it might take a while, or you just have to kind of do a little bit of a SWOT analysis of the region, see, what else is offered like this anywhere near you, even outside the region, and how unique is this. So we have some tools that I can share with Caitlin that can help you guys take a look at those, take inventory of those things. And I know they, at Missouri Humanities Council, they have some tools to do surveys, to collect data from your visitors, see where they're coming from, how many you're getting, and where they're coming from.
And I think too, this is probably a lot easier for smaller communities, but I think word of mouth is a lot of it too. When especially, talking to your local business owners about engaging people that come into their businesses and asking what brings them in. A lot of times you'll hear things like, oh, well, we came for this, but we saw this. And it's like, that right there is your answer. It's like what they came for was the primary, but what they're doing now is secondary. Your business might be their secondary.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think that word of mouth and in smaller communities, especially talking to local business owners, restaurant shop owners, and asking them, engaging your community and let's talk about what people are saying about why they're coming here.
Kayla, I'm so glad you said that, because I would have missed it otherwise. And that, yeah, absolutely. You're completely right. I'll give you a couple examples in Scotland, kind of where I used to work. Whether it was a restaurant there, Keats Cafe, which if they know that area, they know that restaurant, and it did have a little bit of a draw. I wouldn't call that a major primary attraction. And what constitutes a primary and a secondary can depend on your community too, right? So the Arch is a primary attraction, Bass Pro is, but then so is, Walt Disney's Museum and Marceline for that community. Now, do they get the same number of individuals into those? No, right? Like, and if one attraction was next to another, it sure wouldn't seem like a primary attraction. It would be the kind of thing that people are coming to St. Louis necessarily to see, but there is the reason they're coming to Marceline, right? And it does have a draw power beyond themselves. So to consider the context of where it's at and that word of mouth thing, Rutledge, Missouri, there in Scotland County, had a very large flea market, a multi-day flea market that you could talk to folks from Wisconsin, they would know about, but not really advertised too well, never a lot of measurement, but everyone in the area is pretty confident. I would advise to be a little careful about anecdotal evidence, but sometimes it's so overwhelming, it's definitely not deniable.
Any suggestions for tourism tracker? How do we know how to quantify? Is this through overnight stays in hotels primarily?
I would say most of the tourism data the state uses, of course, is based around those kind of things. And obviously, when it comes to when you just want to improve the performance, the best way to start to monetize visitors is if you can catch them in that overnight stay for sure. But I don't think that you necessarily need that to be able to measure like a primary, if the discussion is still around primary and secondary attractions. I don't think you need to have that to determine if something is a primary attraction. If you could, like I said, word of mouth, or if you could collect some just information from visitors, where they're traveling from, and why, a little bit about just why did you come, what brought you here, that can kind of start to yield you some pretty significant data about really what is drawing people to the area, and are they kind of just coming by, are they seeing you on the way to something else, which is still important. Or are they coming directly for you? And it's important to know that for your region, to understand what it is and not to be offended by that necessarily, or to think you need to like compete against it, but then to capitalize on the people that are going to that. Another kind of regionalism I didn't talk much about because it's probably less applicable to most of the people on this call. But something to consider is sort of the big regionalism. So if we zoom way out and we look at something like the Highway 36 corridor or the 44 corridor, and cooperation along those corridors to make sure that you're packaging and framing your attractions together so that as individuals travel that much longer distance than the regions that I'm talking about, which are usually several counties, if we're in a rural area. But those larger regions are also important, and making sure that you're involved in those conversations if there's organizations around those kind of things, making sure that you're advocating for yourself to be included in that packaging, and if it's not there, to try to create it.
What advice do you give to promote coordinated efforts among historical attractions rather than working off a competitive model? And I think this is such a big topic when it comes to this, the idea of creating critical mass, because it's, it gets
Absolutely.
It makes you think less about competition, because I think especially for small communities, a lot of times you feel in competition with your other communities because you really need those tourism dollars.
Absolutely.
Ways to communicate that this is a coordinated effort and we're not trying to compete with one another. How would you go about promoting something like that with, she uses the example of historical attractions?
Yeah, no, that's great. Actually, I think historical attractions are one of the most important ones to connect, because
I think actually there was something that came out that like historical sites and like tourism travel is one of the biggest draws to Missouri. So it's crazy.
I think that most of the time historical attractions require or benefit some of the most from packaging for a couple of reasons. One, because history is very contextual, right? So like if we have several individuals from a similar time period or across several different time periods, it complements each other to discuss history in many different aspects. Whether it's I'm trying to think of a good example, like here in Hannibal we have obviously all the things about Mark Twain and his particular life, but we can complement that with talking about life in Hannibal that was aside from him, and that involved just the everyday people he was living around. Or we can talk about frame some other periods in history of the community. Like we have a good example in our community here is we both have the Molly Brown childhood home museum, which adds another element of another interesting historical figure from a different time, from a different type of notoriety that plays off of Mark Twain's. And then we have a small museum called Jim's Journey, which is an African-American history museum for Northeast Missouri. So, tackling a different part of history that kind of was simultaneous to a lot of the Mark Twain events in life and things like that. I think it complements it in a way. I think it builds more than other types of attractions with historical ones. The other thing with historical attractions is, in my experience, and Caitlin can disagree if she sees this different, is that most historical attractions throughout the state, they definitely have a more regional appeal. And don't take that as anything negative. It just they aren't exactly always the top line things that people are, they're not sites that are sort of well known necessarily everywhere, but when you put them together and you put these historical aspects together, you can really build a feeling of a certain time period, or reviewing a certain time period or a certain era, and they complement each other well. They just really build off of each other super well. The Amana colonies would be an example of that too, I think, and the villages of Van Buren, where like it's sort of local history. It's not a lot of events that are known at a national or multi-state level, but put together, it creates this sort of historical ambiance, if you will, or situation. But kind of to the main part of that question about how to build that, I think this kind of goes back to these fundamental community development pieces, which is, you need to start these efforts by inviting everyone to the table, and it needs to be a sort of an organizational effort, whether it's you actually incorporate like the villages of Van Buren did, or if you're working as an informal work group. It's about making sure that everyone's at the table, is represented there, that you're not, that one group isn't necessarily trying to railroad or take command of it, that you're all coming as equals, even if one of the attractions is larger than the others. That of course it needs to be acknowledged that they may be more of a primary destination than the others, but it doesn't mean they should dictate the entire process and effort. So I think that if you wanted to get something like this started, I would start by inviting leaders and from all those different institutions together. I think it'd be good to review how it is important to be connected, review the information I have today, this kind of thing, to get buy-in from them so they can understand why it's important to coordinate. And then I think you kind of move together to see where you can start, where those places you can start working together. Maybe just do a trial run of a set of events or some cross advertising. If people are a little unsure about it, to see how it goes, to feel out everyone's needs, and to kind of get it going. But I think the key is that everyone has to be involved. You can't dictate to others. They all need to be at the table. There needs to be a mutual understanding of how this can benefit everybody, and then begin somewhere. Pick some place where you have that mutual cooperation, and I'm sure it shows the benefit pretty quickly, I feel.
And to your point there, Stephanie, she's got a question that she answered that I'll get to right after she makes this comment. Which I was actually going to say, and then she said it, which is funny. So St. Louis has created the Historic St. Louis, a group of over 20 historic sites in the region, and it's doing well given 2020 and that it started in the winter of 2018. I've worked with them before, and it's a great way to cross promote, and it's a way for kind of hey, you're visiting this place, that means you're interested in this topic. Why don't you go see what else is about? And I think that is the key mindset to tap into when talking about, creating this regional effort, is you're assuming that if someone's going to visit this place and you have a place kind of like that, you assume that they're going to be interested in your place too. So it's all capitalizing on that.
You got to think about, and I think the thing to encourage, just like Caitlin said, to encourage your colleagues and the folks involved in these other attractions and communities, is that the goal is not to try to fight over that same 3-hour period that they're there. You're trying to stack them on top of each other. You're trying to stack those together and
make them stay longer.
Where you really start making money is when you can get them overnight. And that's the key, is to keep building that and to be at a place where you could get an overnight stay. And that's when the community really starts to profit. And a lot of tourism corporations and departments are funded off of hotel dollars. That allows you to also monetize your efforts a little bit, or give them some capital to run off of. But that's how you got to pitch it. It's that, you're not competing for the same 3 hours. You're trying to build them on top of each other.
Right. So, and Stephanie asked this question earlier, that she works at an institution that's in a major metropolitan area. So she's talking specifically about the St. Louis area. So hugely competitive area, obviously. So she says she's considered a secondary attraction. and how to draw in tourism when they have a limited budget and the big guys don't include you in area tourism, especially when there are so many primary and secondary attractions in one area. And that's
Well,
trouble even getting a hold of an alder person, let alone other leaders in the area.
you know, and I will admit my experience is more in rural areas just because it's where I've worked. But I think that is something that as I was preparing this, I gave a lot of thought to, because I know, like, even when we do community and economic development efforts and extension, yeah, there are plenty of those efforts going on high level St. Louis region, for the cities and things. But we've found that there can be a lot of impact and need at like a neighborhood level. So what I'd say is, and this is just kind of my initial suggestion, is I think that yes, in a community like St. Louis, the largest attractions, they may not be as interested in engaging with smaller secondary attractions. I still think it's to their benefit in a way, but I understand that that's not may not be their reality. I think there's probably room to build these efforts with other similar type attractions that are either like in the same vein of interest or in the same area. So whether you're trying to build it as like a neighborhood approach, because regions, I said, I specifically did not give a limit to region, because it can mean a lot of different things depending where you're at. In a rural area, it can be several towns. In an urban area, it could be a neighborhood, within a city. So whether it's within your neighborhood or with other similar type attractions, to go ahead and try to build that stuff and advertise together. Then when you do that, like that collective effort, that can be something that can stand up next to some of the larger attractions. Like that effort on its own could. So I'm just giving a total hypothetical sort of thing. If you had a community that maybe had several smaller kind of like maybe a music history type attractions, maybe some like I think about St. Louis, think about Scott Joplin House. Maybe there's a couple other things along those lines, maybe even smaller, more regional base. If you're packaging those together, working together to advertise, to show the shared history and to promote each other, well, then all of a sudden you have something like St. Louis's jazz district or history, something that like can be marketed on its own next to bigger things. That's how I would say to approach this. Don't I would say, and then of course, as far as your local leaders, yeah, that's a challenge. And I think maybe inviting them, especially once you've had a chance to begin to organize, inviting them to share the kind of information that we have, to let them understand the significance of how the stuff packaged together can be can become a significant attraction that can maybe change your understanding of the importance of it and the potential of it.
Another question. Are there external resources available which collect and publish economic impact data? Elected officials seem to understand dollars more than number of visits and value published data over anecdotal examples. So external resources to collect economic impact data.
Absolutely. That's definitely, you're speaking their language when you're talking about dollars and cents, to be sure. I say there's a number of resources for that. Of course, some of that comes through Missouri tourism, although, I understand in a bigger metro area, it's sort of a little bit harder to do that in. We also, I mean, you can, there are, in extension, we have some tools that I could share that can kind of help gauge and give you some ideas of how to try to measure that impact. Also, there are a number of firms that can, like I mentioned, GSG earlier is probably one of them that can kind of try to do these kind of measurements for you. I'll try to give Caitlin some resources on ways to try to quantify that. Of course, you can always do that within your own attractions by, obviously your sales and just if you can kind of get an idea of the pull that you're getting. But the general, the broad, sometimes you have to, sometimes it is hard to get that exact dollar figure. So you are just trying to generate it off of some of our best just formulas for estimating, and just highlighting the importance of tourism in general. Sometimes I think local leaders definitely write it off as, especially in areas that have plenty of other industries, like St. Louis, Kansas City, where you have lots of other major industries that dominate the economy. They forget how important it is in general. So even just reviewing the general importance of the overview of the impact of tourism is important. So I work with the state Department of Tourism can provide some of that kind of information. We have some tools that can try to help you estimate at a local level, at a more particular level, what the impact is. And some of the record keeping you do on your own can as well. Caitlin, anything to add to that one? I know you guys probably help a little bit with that.
Not really. I mean, I know that a lot of counties or a lot of like regional planning commissions, those kinds of places publish a lot of data. I mean, chambers of commerce tend to report year-end numbers.
Larger tourism regional or city tourism departments will too. I failed to mention that too. So like you know, your St. Louis area, your Kansas City area, Branson, you know, those tourism departments are going to do their own studies and have a good understanding of the impact of tourism. We get to like even Hannibal sites that they do it less frequently. And then for smaller areas, you may not have that exact, but RPCs, your regional planning commissions, your council of governments, those are another good source to try to get it from.
Yeah. I don't see any more questions. We do have a couple anecdotes or comments that we had that I saved just to make sure we had a little bit of time. But Douglas Warren, who says that he retired as director of finance for Hannibal, has some examples. And one example he said was Hannibal Parks has pickleball courts. The director of parks asked the Convention and Visitors Bureau to post pickleball on the website. Sure as can be, later that year, I met a woman while walking dogs who told me that they would not have chosen Hannibal for their vacation, except for the fact that we now have pickleball courts. So that's kind of a funny way of, like, when you said, Chris, that primary and secondary is kind of in the eye of the beholder, a pickleball court might seem like a secondary attraction, but to this person, it was a primary attraction. So
absolutely,
you never know.
And for them, who knows? You know, and I think the other thing is like, don't discount those secondary things. They're some of the most memorable things. So even if that individual had come for something else, the thing they remember the most is how they played pickleball on vacation, and it's the most memorable thing of the trip.
Right. Well, everybody, we are out of time for the day. We hit it right about 2:00. So I'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Chris, for a great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
I was taking notes too. So this kind of stuff is great information, not just for community development, economic development, people who just are interested in learning how they can work better with other communities. So thank you so much for your presentation. A reminder to all of you attendees that survey will pop up once the webinar is over. I encourage you to fill out that survey. Let us know how we did, what you thought of the program today. This webinar is being recorded. So if this is something you feel like you want to share with other people in your community, or even taking it to those meetings that Chris encouraged you to have with other communities, other institutions, this is going to be available on our Facebook page as soon as it concludes. It'll be a recorded version. It'll also be available on our website, mocommunities.org, in our video archive, and on our YouTube channel. That'll be probably sometime next week once it can get converted to YouTube. But yeah, so it'll be available for everybody as a resource after this concludes. If anybody is interested in seeing more from us, we got lots of different kinds of events, all kinds of topics. So check us out on mocommunities.org/events and see what we've got coming up. But with that, I will say, have a great day, everybody. Chris, thank you again for stepping up to the plate for Missouri Humanities once again. And we hope to work with you again soon. And everybody else, have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Enjoy the weather. Bye, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you all.